So, Levy argues that the bizarre polling results that are often reported in the media aren't due to the epistemic failures of the people being polled. Those people are just as rational as anyone else. The results are due rather to two things. First of all, there are social differences between educated liberals who read all the news and already know all about all these conspiracy theories and so immediately reject them. And then people who have an average media diet that's composed mostly of Facebook posts who are actually taking these polls on the streets. They both respond in a rational way. They draw on their background knowledge and make the best judgment they can. It's just that they belong to different types of epistemic communities. And these bizarre results are also due to the research practices of the people conducting the polls. So again, we're seeing a social epistemological explanation of the phenomena. Why do people believe in these conspiracy theories? It's not that they have a conspiracy mentality, right? That's a psychological trait that they have. It's not that they have epistemic vices, these reprehensible traits that tend to systematically produce false beliefs. It's that they have different social practices. They're drawing on the background knowledge of a different epistemic community. So both of the explanations for why people tend to believe conspiracy theories are social epistemological ones. People belong to different social groups, and you're seeing that reflected in their judgments. And there are these social practices that people engage in when they're conducting these polls, and those practices themselves generate these kind of bizarre results. So it's not about vice epistemology, according to Levy. It's about social epistemology. So the belief divide isn't as wide as people tend to think it is. And what's more, insofar as people do deny things like climate science or the truth of evolution, they're not necessarily being irrational. Now, this is another interesting feature of Levy's argument. He says people who think that climate science is true, that's the majority of people, and people who think that evolutionary theory is true, again, that's the majority of people. They tend to think that people who don't think that those things are true are deficient epistemic agents. Right? There's something wrong with them as individual knowers. And Levy's saying, well, maybe not. He says, what's your basis for believing in climate science or evolution? And he says, most of us are actually unable to assess the science for ourselves to any serious extent. Climate science is backed up by these really complicated mathematical models that most people aren't even in a position to understand. And he says, if you really think about it, the reason that you trust climate science and the reason that you think that evolutionary theory is true is that you take the message on trust. You trust that science is well ordered, that the data is reported responsibly, that the institutions of science work to catch errors and to stress test claims and so on. And of course, he says, that trust is warranted. Science is characterized by multiple error correction mechanisms. If someone engages in fraud or makes mistakes, others who are better placed to pick up the problem will do so, usually sooner rather than later. But that's not the reason why people trust science. The reason people trust science is just because they've been socialized to do so. They grow up, they get educated. In the course of that education, they learn that scientific claims should be trusted. So Levy is saying, to the degree that there is a partisan divide, it doesn't arise from the fact that people who say don't believe in climate change are stupid or irrational. It arises from the fact that we place trust in different sources. So people who believe in climate science and evolutionary theory, they don't know that much about these things. They're not even in a position to assess the truth of those theories because they haven't studied them to any great extent. But they've been socialized to place their trust in science. And people who deny climate science have been socialized to place their trust in other sources, in their religious leaders or in their political leaders or leaders of their community, whoever it is that they're trusting. And so the idea is this disagreement between left and right, or between people who trust science and people who trust some other source, it isn't anything to do with the rationality of the particular individuals. It's to do with which sources of information their epistemic communities socialize them to trust. So to summarize Levy's article, he argues the extent to which people believe wildly implausible stuff is exaggerated. It's exaggerated because of the techniques that are used in the polls. And people who deny climate change and evolutionary theory don't typically know less than the people who endorse those things. Rather, they've been socialized to put their trust in different sources. Okay, so people who believe in climate change don't actually tend to know that much about it. They don't understand the deep mathematical models underwriting the theory, but they've been socialized to trust science. The people who deny it, they don't know that much about it either, but they've been socialized to trust other sources. Okay, so like I said, there are obvious tensions between Kassam's presentation of the problem and Levy's presentation of the problem. Kassam really focuses on individual epistemic vices, and Levy focuses on questions about social epistemology. And your task now is to think about, like, what do you think is true? Do you think that Kassam is right, that people who do endorse conspiracy theories and who spread them online actually have epistemic vices, like they're epistemically insouciant, and that that's reprehensible and blameworthy? Or do you think that we should say, well, they're just as rational as anyone else, they just belong to a different kind of epistemic community? Or do you think that the truth is kind of somewhere in between? I do want to say, though, at the end here, I'll share my own opinion about one thing. I think that Levy is right to a certain extent to say that people in these different groups who either trust climate science or don't do often trust climate science, say, because they've been socialized to trust the claims of science and they don't really know that much about climate science per se. However, if you know anything about science and understand that science is this sustained engagement with the empirical world, then even without knowing the specific details of climate science, you are in a more rational, more justifiable position when you trust the claims of science rather than not trusting them. So what I mean by that is, if you understand how science works, then it is in fact more rational to endorse the claims of climate science and to endorse evolutionary theory. And by the end of this module, after we've talked about the book, Why Trust Science, you will be in a position to endorse the claims of climate science, to endorse evolutionary theory, not because you understand the ins and outs and the details of those different theories, but you will understand what the error correction mechanisms that are built into science that are designed to root out false beliefs. You'll have an understanding of what those things are, and on the basis of that, you will be in a position to say, yeah, I trust the claims of science, not merely because I was socialized to do so, but because I understand how science works and why its claims are justified. Finally, I just want to call your attention to some links that I've given you on Moodle to some different podcasts looking at some of these issues. So first, I have some reporting about the QAnon conspiracy theory from The Intercept and from Today Explained. Those podcasts obviously have some sort of obvious political angles. I'd like you to ignore that. I'm not trying to promote any kind of political angle in sharing that information with you. I'm sharing these podcasts because the reporting is interesting and it kind of gives you a background understanding of the QAnon conspiracy theory, which is one that's having a lot of influence right now. I also shared with you a fake news survival guide that gives you some good techniques for protecting yourself from fake news online. I hope you'll take a look at it. It's useful and it can help you actually in doing your research. I'm also sharing a podcast with you from This American Life, and that's where John Ronson does a portrait of the conspiracy theorist Alex Jones. And the reason I'm sharing these podcasts with you also is that I think that they show that these questions that we're asking this term, what kind of knower do I want to be, and what kind of epistemic community do I want to belong to, they're not purely epistemic questions, right? They're not questions just about knowledge, because what we know, like what kind of knower we are and what kind of epistemic community we belong to, also has deep ethical implications. So if you're out there spreading conspiracy theories that are designed to, for example, undermine the interests of women and minorities, then your knowledge practices and your status as a knower is having significant ethical consequences. And if you're promoting conspiracy theories that are sort of weaponized against people who have lost loved ones in gun massacres, then you're also, as a knower, doing things that have bad ethical consequences. The point is, these questions that we're asking, what kind of knower do I want to be, and what kind of knowledge community do I want to belong to, are not purely epistemic questions, right? They're also ethical ones. I want to conclude with one last story from my own hometown in San Antonio that looks at this kind of ethical dimension of these epistemic questions. This is a story from my hometown of San Antonio, and the Methodist healthcare system there, which kind of reflects this point about the ethical dimension of the epistemic, or the idea that the epistemic is ethical. This is a story about a party that was held by someone who was diagnosed with COVID. This was back in July in San Antonio. And the thought was to invite as many people over to their apartment as they could to see if the virus is real and to see if anyone gets infected. So the person telling the story here is Dr. Jane Appleby. She's the chief medical officer who runs the Methodist healthcare system in San Antonio. And she had a patient come in who had gone to one of these COVID parties. And she said that just before the patient died, they looked at their nurse and said, "I made a mistake. I thought this was a hoax, but it's not." This is an example, I mean, this is a very dark example, but it's an example that shows you that the epistemic is ethical. People are online spreading these conspiracy theories, saying the coronavirus and the COVID disease are a hoax, and that it's really just a conspiracy, and that it's not real, right? All these various things. And people are spreading that information online. And the consequence can be, in some circumstances, really ethically dire, right? So this young man died. He was 30 years old, and he died from this infection, just perfectly innocent, going to this party, thinking that the whole thing was a hoax, right? And if you think about it from Levy's perspective, it's not his fault that he thought it was a hoax. He's not up on all these conspiracy theories. He doesn't have all the relevant background information about assessing viruses and all these sorts of things. He's just going along with thinking about these things in a way that people in his epistemic community think about them. And the point is, these questions, what kind of knower do I want to be? What kind of knowledge community do I want to belong to? They have deep ethical significance, because the kind of knower that you are and the kind of epistemic community that you belong to has ethical consequences.